I'm Marcus Thompson, 34. And for 3 years, I've been the night janitor at Whitmore Academy, one of those elite private schools where tuition costs more than most people's salaries. I thought I knew this place. Marble hallways, trust fund kids, and teachers who drove cars worth more than my house. But last Tuesday night, while emptying trash in the faculty lounge, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. What I found wasn't just shocking, it was evidence of a system so corrupt, so deliberately cruel to the students there. Supposed to protect, that it changed everything I thought I knew about education. Power, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. The worst part, I realized I'd been cleaning up after their crimes for years without even knowing it. If you've ever wondered what really happens behind closed doors in places of power, subscribe, because this story will change how you see authority forever. Before I tell you about that night that changed everything, you need to understand who I am and how I ended up at Whitmore Academy in the first place. I'm a single father to Sarah, my 12-year-old daughter who means everything to me. Her mother left when Sarah was 3, just packed up one day and moved across the country with some guy she met online. I won't lie, those early years were brutal. Juggling work, daycare, and trying to be both parents to a little girl who kept asking when mommy was coming home. But we made it work. Sarah's smart as a whip and has this incredible sense of justice that sometimes scares me. She's the kind of kid who speaks up when she sees bullying, who questions why some kids get free lunch while others don't, who notices when things aren't fair. Maybe that's why what I discovered at Whitmore hit me so hard. I kept thinking about Sarah and how she'd react to what I was seeing. For 15 years, I've been a janitor. Started right out of high school when college wasn't in the cards financially. I've cleaned offices, hospitals, and schools. Mostly schools, actually. There's something about working in education that appeals to me, even if I'm not the one doing the teaching. I've seen real teachers, the ones who stay late to help struggling students, who spend their own money on supplies, who genuinely care about every kid in their classroom regardless of their background. I worked at Lincoln Elementary for 6 years, watching teachers work miracles with limited resources. Mrs. Rodriguez taught 2nd grade and somehow managed to make every single student feel special. She'd bring extra snacks for kids who didn't have lunch money, stay after school to help with homework, and even started a weekend reading program in her own apartment for kids who needed extra support. That's what I thought teaching was about: dedication, sacrifice, making a difference. Then budget cuts hit. The district laid off half the support staff, including me. I scrambled to find work, taking whatever I could get. Gas stations, retail stores, anything to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. Sarah never complained, even when dinner was ramen noodles for the 3rd night in a row. Even when I had to tell her we couldn't afford the school field trip. That's when I heard about the opening at Whitmore Academy. The pay was almost double what I'd made at Lincoln, plus health insurance and benefits. It seemed too good to be true. The woman who interviewed me, Mrs. Henderson from Human Resources, explained that they valued their support staff and believed in treating everyone with dignity and respect. She showed me around the pristine campus, the library that looked like something from a movie, the science labs with equipment I'd never seen before, the dining hall that served actual gourmet meals. We're not just maintaining a building, she told me. We're supporting an educational mission that shapes future leaders. I believed her. God help me. I actually believed her. The job was simple enough. Night shift, Monday through Friday, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Clean classrooms, empty trash, maintain the common areas. The pay meant Sarah and I could move out of our cramped apartment into a small house with a yard. She could join the soccer team, take piano lessons, have some of the opportunities I'd always wanted to give her. My first day, I was struck by the sheer wealth of the place. Hallways had actual marble floors, not the linoleum I was used to. The classrooms had smart boards, brand new textbooks, and supplies that most public schools could only dream of. Students left behind designer backpacks, expensive laptops, and clothes that cost more than my weekly salary. But it wasn't just the money, it was the attitude. At Lincoln, teachers appreciated the custodial staff. They'd chat with us, ask about our families, treat us like human beings. At Whitmore, I might as well have been invisible. Teachers walked past me without acknowledgement. Students acted like I didn't exist. Parents looked right through me when they visited. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to provide for Sarah. and give her the future she deserved. The work was honest, the pay was good, and if people wanted to ignore me, that was their problem. Looking back now, I realized that invisibility was exactly what allowed me to see what I eventually saw. When people don't notice you, they don't guard their words or actions around you. They don't think about what you might overhear, or what you might piece together from the evidence. They carelessly throw away. That invisibility would eventually become my greatest asset in uncovering the truth about Whitmore Academy. But first, I had to learn to see past the golden facade that had fooled me for so long. My first few months at Whitmore were like living in a completely different world. Every morning when I picked up Sarah from school and drove her home past Whitmore's imposing gates, the contrast was jarring. Her public school had portable classrooms, outdated textbooks held together with duct tape, and a playground where half the equipment was broken and tagged with "Do Not Use" signs. Whitmore's campus, on the other hand, looked like something out of a college brochure. The main building was this stunning brick and stone structure, with ivy climbing the walls and tall windows that caught the afternoon light perfectly. The school's marketing materials, those glossy brochures I'd find scattered around the admissions. Office proms excellence and character development in an environment where every student can thrive. They featured photos of diverse, smiling students engaged in state-of-the-art science experiments, discussing literature in small seminars, and participating in community service projects. The reality was more complicated. My shift started at 6 p.m., just as the last of the after-school activities were wrapping up. I'd arrived to find the parking lot still half full of luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, the occasional Tesla, parents picking up their kids dressed like they were heading to country club dinners, which they probably were. The students themselves looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Even after a full day of classes and activities, I started in the main academic building, working my way through classrooms that were immaculate compared to what I was used to. Every room had the latest technology, comfortable seating, and supplies that seemed limitless. The trash cans yielded evidence of a lifestyle I could barely comprehend, discarded designer notebooks barely used, expensive pens that wrote perfectly, well, but were thrown away after losing a cap, leftover lunches from high-end restaurants that students had ordered for delivery. The waste bothered me more than it should have. I kept thinking about Sarah's classroom, where students shared decade-old textbooks, and teachers begged parents to donate basic supplies like pencils and tissue paper. Here, abundance was so taken for granted that perfectly good materials were discarded without a second thought. But it wasn't just the material wealth that struck him at it was the atmosphere. During my occasional interactions with day shift staff, I heard conversations that revealed a strange undercurrent of tension. Teachers would whisper in the hallways, their voices dropping when administrators passed by. I noticed how certain students' names were spoken with a particular tone of careful neutrality. While others were discussed more freely, there was an invisible hierarchy that took weeks for me to start understanding. Some students could apparently do no wrong. Their papers were returned with glowing comments even when I could see obvious errors. Their behavior was excused with phrases like spirited or showing leadership potential. Others faced scrutiny for minor infractions, their work held to impossibly high standards. I remember one evening finding a crumpled essay in a classroom trash can. The student's name was Maria Santos, clearly one of the scholarship kids based on her home address listed on the header. The paper was about economic inequality, well-researched and thoughtfully written, but it was covered in red ink, criticized for lacking depth and failing to consider multiple perspectives. The grade was a C-. The next night, in the same classroom, I found another discarded essay. This one was from Bradley Whitman III, whose family name was engraved on a plaque in the main lobby as major donors. His paper on the same topic was poorly organized, contained several factual errors I could spot even without being an expert, and seemed to argue that poverty was largely a result of personal failings. It received an ominous with comments praising his bold thinking and mature analysis. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Teachers have different standards, different expectations. Maybe Bradley's paper had qualities I wasn't sophisticated enough to recognize. Maybe Maria's paper had flaws that weren't obvious to me, but the seed of doubt was planted. Other small things began to bother me. The way certain students' disciplinary reports seemed to disappear from the files I emptied. How some families received detailed progress reports while others got generic form letters. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms to empty trash cans one evening. While cleaning the main office, I overheard Dean Mitchell on a phone call that made my blood run cold. She was speaking to a parent about their son's behavior. Apparently, he'd been caught cheating on a major exam. But instead of discussing consequences, she was explaining how they could handle the situation discreetly, to avoid any permanent record that might affect college applications. "We understand that Jonathan is under tremendous pressure," she said in soothing tones. "Sometimes good students make poor choices when they're overwhelmed. We're confident this was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect his true character. Wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this was compassionate discipline, focusing on learning rather than punishment. But something about the tone, the careful language about avoiding permanent records, felt wrong. It felt like the kind of conversation that wouldn't happen for every student. As weeks turned into months, I began to notice patterns that I couldn't ignore. The scholarship students, and you could always tell who they were by their addresses. Their less expensive clothes, the way they carried themselves with a subtle awareness of not quite belonging, seemed to face different rules entirely. Their mistakes were permanent, their successes downplayed, their potential questioned at every turn. Meanwhile, the children of major donors lived in a world where failure was impossible, where every stumble was reframed as a learning experience, where their futures were protected no matter what they did in the present. I was still trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my working-class background was making me oversensitive to natural differences in how families engaged with the school. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that Whitmore Academy's beautiful facade hid something much uglier. The glossy brochures promised excellence and character. What they delivered was a system designed to perpetuate privilege regardless of merit, wrapped in the language of educational excellence. Working the night shift at Whitmore gave me access to a version of the school that most people never saw. After 8 p.m., when the last of the evening activities ended and the building settled into quiet, I became the sole witness to a different kind of education happening in those marble halls. My routine was methodical: start with the classrooms on the 3rd floor, work my way down through the administrative offices, then finish with the common areas and gymnasium. Most nights I worked alone except for the occasional security guard making rounds. But some nights I noticed things that didn't fit the pattern. Certain Wednesdays, I'd arrived to find cars still in the faculty parking lot well past the time, when even the most dedicated teacher should have gone home. Not just 1 or 2 cars, but 5 or 6, always the same vehicles belonging to senior faculty and administrators. The lights would be on in the main conference room, and I'd hear the low murmur of voices through the thick wooden doors at first. I assumed these were routine faculty meetings that ran late, but something about them felt different. The participants spoke in hushed tones, even though the building was empty. When I knocked to ask if they needed anything before I cleaned that area, the conversations would stop abruptly, and Dean Mitchell would emerge to tell me they'd be finished soon and I should come back later. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. While emptying trash in the hallway outside the conference room, I noticed a document had been dropped near the door, probably fell out of someone's folder. It was a security camera schedule, showing the locations and timing of all surveillance equipment throughout the school. But what caught my attention were the handwritten notes in the margins, marking specific time periods as system maintenance or offline for updates. The pattern was unmistakable. Every Wednesday evening from 7 to 10 p.m. The cameras in the main conference room and adjacent hallways were mysteriously offline for maintenance. The same maintenance window every single week during exactly the hours when those mysterious faculty meetings took place. I started paying closer attention to these Wednesday gatherings. The participants were always the same core group: Headmaster Blackwood, Dean Mitchell, the head of college counseling, Mrs. Pemberton, and several department heads whose children all seemed to attend prestigious universities despite academic records that I'd glimpsed in discarded drafts and notes. Their meetings had a ritual quality that felt more conspiracy than collaboration. They'd arrive separately, park in different areas of the lot, and enter through side doors rather than the main entrance. After their sessions, they'd leave the same way separately, quietly, like people who didn't want to be seen together. But it wasn't just the Wednesday meetings that troubled me. I began noticing other patterns that suggested a deliberate effort to avoid oversight and documentation. Certain filing cabinets in the administrative offices were always locked, even during the day when staff supposedly needed access to student records. Mrs. Henderson from HR would personally handle specific files, keeping them in her office rather than the general filing system. When I'd clean her office, I'd see stacks of folders on her desk with sticky notes that read "handle personally" or "no copies." The college counseling office had its own set of irregularities. Mrs. Pemberton kept 2 sets of filing systems, the official one that other staff could access, and a smaller, locked cabinet that she alone controlled. Drafts of letters in her trash, fragments that mentioned special circumstances and family contributions in the context of college recommendations. During my 3rd month at Whitmore, I witnessed something that crystallized my growing suspicions. I was cleaning the main office late one Thursday night when I heard voices from Headmaster Blackwood's private office. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him meeting with a man I recognized as Senator Morrison, whose daughter attended Whitmore. Their conversation was hard to follow, but certain phrases cut through clearly. Handling the Princeton situation, ensuring no record of the incident, and most disturbing of all, the family's continued support depends on our discretion. Senator Morrison left through the back exit that connected directly to the administrative parking area, route that would avoid the main security cameras and any record of his visit. The next morning, I noticed that his daughter Emma, who'd been struggling in advanced placement chemistry according to graded assignments I'd seen in the trash, suddenly had her name posted on the academic honor roll. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. These weren't just wealthy families getting better service. This was systematic manipulation of academic records, college recommendations, and disciplinary procedures. The Wednesday meetings, the locked files, the carefully timed camera maintenance, the secret entrances and exits had all pointed to a coordinated effort to hide something significant. But the most chilling realization came when I found a discarded memo in Dean Mitchell's trash. It was a draft of new discretionary policies for handling sensitive student matters. The language was carefully crafted to sound educational and supportive. But between the lines was a blueprint for covering up misconduct, altering records, and ensuring that certain students faced no real consequences for their actions. The memo specifically mentioned maintaining institutional relationships with key families and ensuring appropriate flexibility in academic and UTE tannery standards. It was bureaucratic language for a corrupt system that put wealth and influence above education and fairness. As I continued my rounds that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something much larger than individual cases of favoritism. This was institutional corruption, carefully planned and methodically executed. The beautiful facade of Whitmore Academy hid a system designed to ensure that privilege perpetuated itself, regardless of merit, character, or justice, and I was the only one in a position to see it all, invisible in the darkness, cleaning up the evidence of their crimes. To understand how deep the corruption ran at Whitmore Academy, you need to understand the people who made it possible. Over my months of invisible observation, I began to see the key players not just as educators, but as architects of a system designed to protect wealth and privilege above all else. Headmaster Charles Blackwood was Whitmore's public face, distinguished, articulate, and seemingly committed to educational excellence. His office walls were covered with awards and photos of him with politicians, business leaders, and celebrities whose children had attended the school. He spoke eloquently at school events about character development and academic integrity, his words carrying the weight of someone who genuinely believed in education's transformative power. But in the darkness of those Wednesday night meetings, I saw a different Blackwood. He was the orchestrator, the one who set the tone for how special cases should be handled. His conversations revealed a man who viewed education not as a public trust, but as a commodity to be carefully managed for maximum benefit to the institution and its most valuable clients. Dean Rebecca Mitchell was Blackwood's enforcer, a person responsible for implementing the policies that maintained Whitmore's dual standard. She had a talent for making corruption sound compassionate, framing academic fraud as individualized learning approaches and disciplinary cover-ups as restorative justice practices. Her office contained the school's official disciplinary code manual, thick binder that outlined strict policies for academic integrity, behavioral expectations, consequences for violations. What made that manual particularly sinister was how selectively it was applied. The policies themselves were admirably comprehensive and fair. Students caught cheating faced automatic failure and mandatory academic integrity workshops. Bullying resulted in immediate suspension and required counseling, drug or alcohol violations, meant potential expulsion and notification of college admissions offices. But these consequences only applied to students whose families lacked influence. For the children of major donors, board members, and prominent alumni, the same manual became a starting point for creative interpretation. Cheating became academic stress response requiring support. Bullying was reframed as leadership style needing refinement. Drug violations disappeared entirely or were transformed into medical consultations for anxiety management. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton ran college counseling like a concierge service for the wealthy. She maintained detailed files on every family's connections, donation history, and potential future contributions. Her recommendations weren't based solely on student achievement, but on a complex calculation of family value to the institution. She could craft a recommendation letter that made a mediocre student sound exceptional, while simultaneously damning a brilliant scholarship student with faint praise and subtle suggestions about fit and readiness. The department heads fell into two categories: willing collaborators and reluctant participants. Dr. Harrison, in mathematics, genuinely loved teaching but had learned to read the subtle signals about which students required flexibility in grading. Mrs. Foster, in English, struggled visibly with the compromises she was asked to make, but needed her job and understood the consequences of resistance. Then there were the true believers, like Coach Williams, who ran the athletics program, embraced the system wholeheartedly, viewing wealthy families as investments in the school's future. He'd openly discuss how certain students' potential extended beyond their current performance, clearly indicating that family status was part of his evaluation criteria. The most insidious aspect of this hierarchy was how it corrupted even well-intentioned people. Teachers who started with genuine educational ideals gradually adapted to survive. They learned to see favoritism as differentiated instruction and academic fraud as alternative assessment methods. The language of progressive education was weaponized to hide regressive practices. The student body itself reflected this institutional corruption. The children of donors developed an unconscious arrogance, a certainty that rules didn't really apply to them. They spoke to teachers with casual disrespect, secure in the knowledge that consequences wouldn't follow. Freely and generally behaved like young aristocrats who understood their protected status. Meanwhile, scholarship students lived in constant anxiety. They knew their position was precarious, that any misstep could result in immediate consequences. While their wealthy classmates faced none, they worked twice as hard for half the recognition, watched their achievements be minimized, while inferior work from privileged students was celebrated. The psychological damage was profound. Talented students from working-class families learned to doubt their abilities, to assume that their struggles meant they weren't smart enough for Whitmore's standards. They internalized the message that their best efforts weren't sufficient, not realizing that the game was rigged against them from the start. Parents played their roles in this elaborate theater. Wealthy families treated the school like a service provider, making demands and expecting accommodation. They spoke of their investment in Whitmore and the return they expected in terms of their children's outcomes. They attended events not as proud supporters of education, but as clients checking on their purchase. The families of scholarship students, in contrast, were kept at arm's length. They were made to feel grateful for the opportunity their children received, reminded constantly that they were beneficiaries of institutional generosity rather than participants in an educational community. Board meetings were carefully orchestrated. Performances where predetermined decisions were rubber-stamped with the appearance of democratic process. Real decisions happened in private conversations between Blackwood and major donors, where policy was shaped by financial considerations rather than educational merit. The Whitmore way, as they called it in official communications, was supposedly about developing character and preparing students for leadership. In practice, it was a finishing school for privilege, where wealthy children learned that money could solve any problem and rules were suggestions rather than requirements. What made it all so devastating was how seamlessly the corruption was woven into the fabric of what could have been an excellent educational institution. The resources were there, the facilities were extraordinary, and many of the teachers were genuinely talented educators. But it was all poisoned by a system that valued wealth above learning, influence above integrity, and privilege above justice. As I observed this elaborate machinery of corruption, night after night, I began to understand that I wasn't just witnessing isolated incidents of favoritism. I was seeing the systematic destruction of educational ideals, the transformation of a school into a machine for perpetuating inequality across generations. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I'd come home from my shift at Whitmore feeling particularly troubled after witnessing another example of the school's selective justice system. And I found Sarah at our kitchen table working on homework with unusual intensity. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, hanging up my jacket and trying to shake off the weight of what I'd seen that night. "How was school?" She looked up from her notebook with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of her mother, but with a determination that was entirely her own. "Dad, can I ask you something about fairness?" The question hit me harder than it should have. After months of watching Whitmore's systematic unfairness, the word felt loaded with implications I wasn't ready to face. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Sarah held up her assignment, a typed essay for her social studies class. The heading read, "What does justice mean to me?" And I could see she'd put real thought into it, with careful handwriting and multiple draft marks where she'd revised her ideas. I wrote about how justice means everyone getting treated the same way, no matter who they are or how much money their family has, she said. "But then I started thinking about your school, and I got confused." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Well, you always tell me that good schools have good teachers who care about all their students equally, right? That if kids work hard and follow the rules, they get rewarded for it?" I nodded, remembering all the conversations we'd had about education, about how school was her opportunity to build whatever future she wanted through hard work and dedication. "But sometimes when you come home from work, you look really sad or angry. And last week when we drove past your school, you pointed out all those expensive cars and said something about how different worlds don't usually mix well." The perceptiveness of 12-year-olds can be devastating. Sarah had been watching me more carefully than I'd realized, picking up on the emotional toll that Whitmore was taking even when I thought I was hiding it. "I just meant that rich people and regular people sometimes have different experiences," I said carefully, not wanting to burden her with adult complexities, but also not wanting to lie. Sarah frowned and looked back at her essay. "But that's not fair, is it? If a school is supposed to be about learning and growing, shouldn't everyone get the same chance to succeed?" She read a paragraph from her assignment. "Justice means that when people do the same things, they get the same results. If two students both cheat on a test, they should both face the same consequences. If two students both work really hard, they should both get recognized for their effort. A person's family shouldn't matter more than their character or their choices." The words cut through me like a blade. Here was my 12-year-old daughter articulating the very principles that Whitmore Academy violated every single day. She understood instinctively what the adults at that institution had forgotten or chosen to ignore. "That's a really good point." "Sarah," I managed to say, "what made you think about this?" "There's this girl in my class, Maria Santos. She's super smart and works harder than anyone, but she always seems worried about something. Yesterday she was crying because she might not be able to go on the field trip to the science museum because her mom can't afford the fee. But there are other kids who go on vacation to Europe and act like it's no big deal." My heart stopped. Maria Santos. The same name I'd seen on that crumpled essay at Whitmore. The scholarship student whose excellent work had been graded harshly while mediocre papers from wealthy students received praise. "But what really bothers me," Sarah continued, "is that some adults seem to think that's okay. Like, they act like some kids deserve more chances just because their parents have more money. How is that justice?" I sat down beside her, feeling the weight of her question and the weight of what I knew about Whitmore. Here was my daughter at 12 years old, grappling with concepts that supposedly educated adults had abandoned in favor of institutional corruption. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly. "That's not justice at all. So what do you do when you see unfairness like that? When you know something is wrong, but you're not sure how to fix it?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Sarah was asking me not just as her father, but as someone who worked in a school, someone who was supposed to support education and fairness. She was asking me to reconcile the values I'd taught her with the reality I was witnessing every night. I said slowly, "Adults have to make hard choices about whether to speak up when they see something wrong, even if it might be difficult or scary. But shouldn't they always speak up? I mean, if you know something is hurting people and you don't say anything, aren't you kind of helping the bad thing continue?" The moral clarity of her question was devastating. Sarah wasn't burdened by concerns about job security, mortgage payments, or the complex politics of adult institutions. She saw the situation with the ethical simplicity that adults often lose. If something is wrong, you have an obligation to try to make it right. What would you do? I asked her. Sarah didn't hesitate. I'd gather evidence first, so people would believe me. Then I'd tell someone who has the power to fix it. And if they didn't listen, I'd tell someone else, and keep telling people until someone cared enough to do something about it. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat in our small living room looking at her essay about justice. Her words echoed in my mind. A person's family shouldn't matter more than their character, or their choices. She had written about fairness with the passionate conviction of someone who still believed the world should be just. I thought about Maria Santos, struggling in my daughter's public school, while another Maria Santos, at Whitmore, faced systematic discrimination despite her academic excellence. I thought about all the scholarship students I'd watched being crushed by a system designed to favor wealth over merit. I thought about the teachers who'd given up their principals to keep their jobs, and the administrators who'd turned education into a commodity. Most of all, I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be for Sarah. Did I want to be someone who taught her about justice while staying silent in the face of injustice? Someone who talked about doing the right thing while doing nothing when it mattered most. Sarah's assignment had forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. My silence was complicity. Every night I cleaned up the evidence of Whitmore's corruption. Without acting on it, I was helping that system continue. I was betraying not just the students being harmed, but the values I was trying to instill in my own daughter. Her essay about justice had become my call to action. Sarah's essay about justice was still fresh in my mind. The following Tuesday night, when I made the discovery that would change everything, I was emptying the trash in the faculty lounge, the same room where I'd found that first crumpled grade. Report when I noticed something unusual in Dean at Mitchell's wastebasket. Instead of the typical mix of coffee cups and meeting notes, there was a manila folder that had been hastily shoved down among the debris. The tab was still visible, labeled Grade Modifications, October. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out, knowing I was crossing a line from passive observation to active investigation. What I found inside that folder was a systematic record of academic fraud that took my breath away. The documents were grade change forms, official school paperwork that required multiple signatures to alter a student's academic record. Each form detailed the original grade, the modified grade, and a justification for the change. But these weren't isolated corrections for calculation errors or legitimate resubmissions. These were wholesale transformations of academic failure into success. All for students whose last names I recognized from the donor plaques in the main lobby. Bradley Whitman III, whose poorly written essay I'd found weeks earlier, had received grade changes in 3 different subjects. His original grade in advanced physics was an F. Changed to a B+ with the justification accommodated assessment better reflected true understanding. His history grade went from D to A due to additional credit project demonstrating exceptional insight. Most egregiously, his English grade was raised from F to B because of revised scoring rubric that better aligned with learning objectives. But it wasn't just Bradley. The folder contained dozens of similar forms, creating a clear picture of how Whitmore protected its most valuable students from the consequences of academic failure. Emma Morrison, I'd seen receive sudden honor roll recognition, had failed advanced chemistry twice. Her grades were systematically altered from F to B+ using justifications, like laboratory practical demonstrated mastery despite test anxiety and portfolio. Assessment revealed deeper understanding than traditional metrics indicated. Victoria Pemberton, yes. The college counselor's own daughter had received grade changes in 4 subjects during her junior year. Her transcripts showed stellar performance, but the modification forms revealed original grades that would have made college admission impossible. Each change was justified with educational jargon that sounded progressive but masked academic dishonesty. The most disturbing aspect was how sophisticated the system had become. These weren't crude alterations that would be easily detected. Each modification was accompanied by retroactive documentation that made the changes appear legitimate. New assignments were created and backdated. Test scores were recalculated using different weighting systems. Projects that never existed appeared in gradebooks with detailed rubrics and evaluation criteria. The forms required signatures from the original teacher, the department head, and a guidance counselor. But what made my blood run cold was seeing how many teachers had clearly been pressured into compliance. Some signatures were hesitant, shaky, accompanied by handwritten notes expressing concern. Others had notes like discussed family situation, or considering broader context that suggested coercion rather than educational judgment. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking as I realized the implications. This wasn't just favoritism or grade inflation. This was systematic falsification of academic records that would follow these students to college and beyond. Admissions officers making decisions based on fraudulent transcripts. Scholarships awarded to undeserving candidates while qualified students were rejected. But the folder contained something even more damning, a spreadsheet tracking donor status. Correlation with academic adjustments. It was a coldly calculated document that showed how grade modifications directly corresponded to family giving levels. Students whose families donated more than $100,000 annually received an average of 1.3 grade points in modification. Those whose families gave between $50,000 and $100,000 received an average of 0.8 points. Families giving less than $50,000 received no modifications at all. The spreadsheet included a section for scholarship students with a note that read, "Maintain rigorous standards to preserve program integrity." This wasn't just about helping wealthy students. It was about deliberately maintaining impossible standards for scholarship recipients to justify their eventual failure and removal from the program. As I continued reading, found correspondence between Dean Mitchell and Mrs. Pemberton discussing acceptable modification limits and maintaining plausible documentation. One email chain revealed their concern about a history teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who had been resistant to accommodating family requests and needed to be brought into alignment with institutional expectations. The next document in the folder made me physically ill. It was a termination letter draft for Ms. Rodriguez, citing inflexibility in pedagogical approach and failure to embrace differentiated assessment strategies. In reality, she was being fired for refusing to participate in grade fraud. Replacement would be someone more collaborative, with administrative priorities. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a list of scholarship students who had been counseled out of Whitmore over the past 3 years. Maria Santos was on that list, along with 15 other students whose academic records showed genuine excellence, but who had been systematically discouraged, failed on technicalities, or forced out through disciplinary actions that seemed to target them specifically. Each departed scholarship student was replaced by a full-paying student whose academic credentials were significantly weaker, but whose family connections were substantially stronger. The admission files showed this pattern clearly. Exceptional students from working-class families were admitted to maintain Whitmore's academic reputation and pushed out to make room for wealthy students who couldn't compete academically. The folder also contained communication with college admissions offices, revealing how Whitmore's corruption extended beyond its own walls. Mrs. Pemberton had ongoing relationships with admissions counselors at prestigious universities. Relationships that involved careful coordination of which students would be presented, when and how their applications would be positioned. There were drafts of recommendation letters that bore no resemblance to the students' actual performance. Bradley Whitman was described as one of the most intellectually curious students I've encountered in 20 years of education, despite evidence of chronic academic failure. Emma Morrison was praised for her exceptional leadership and moral character, while scholarship students with actual leadership experience and ethical behavior received lukewarm recommendations that damned them with faint praise. As I stood in that faculty lounge, surrounded by evidence of systematic educational corruption, I felt a rage building that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about wealthy families buying better opportunities for their children. It was about the deliberate destruction of merit-based education. It's the systematic crushing of working-class dreams and the transformation of learning into a commodity available only to those who could afford it. These weren't isolated incidents or gray area judgment calls. This was institutional fraud, carefully planned and methodically executed. Students were being cheated, both the wealthy ones who were learning that money could solve any problem, and the scholarship students who were being taught that their best efforts would never be enough. I thought about Sarah's essay, about her belief that justice meant everyone getting treated the same way, regardless of their family's wealth. I thought about Maria Santos crying over a field trip fee, while another, Maria Santos, had been systematically driven out of Whitmore, despite her academic excellence. The grade modification forms were more than evidence of corruption. They were proof of a system designed to perpetuate inequality across generations, ensuring that wealth and privilege would triumph over merit and character every single time. The grade modification forms had opened a door I couldn't close. Once I knew what to look for, evidence of Whitmore's corruption seemed to reveal itself everywhere I turned. My nightly routine transformed from simple janitorial work into careful investigation. So I began to understand the full scope of the institution's betrayal of its educational mission. 2 nights after discovering the grade modifications, I found myself in Headmaster Blackwood's office emptying his personal trash. When I noticed a thick folder partially hidden beneath some newspapers, the tab read, Development Office, Confidential Donor Relations. And inside was a treasure trove of documents that revealed the financial machinery driving Whitmore's academic fraud. The centerpiece was a spreadsheet titled Family Investment Analysis that made my stomach turn. It wasn't tracking charitable giving or educational support. It was calculating the return on investment that wealthy families expected from their donations to Whitmore. Each family was assigned a numerical score based on their giving history, political connections, business influence, and potential future contributions. The Whitman family, whose son Bradley I'd watched receive fraudulent grade modifications, had a score of 9.8 out of 10. Their annual giving of $250,000 was supplemented by business contracts worth another $400,000. The family's construction company had built Whitmore's new gymnasium and was slated to handle the upcoming dormitory expansion. The notes section included phrases like Bradley college placement critical for continued relationship and Princeton admission non-negotiable priority. Senator Morrison's family scored 9.5, with their political connections valued almost as highly as their financial contributions. The notes mentioned Federal Education Committee influence and regulatory protection considerations. Emma's academic struggles were noted not as an educational concern, but as a reputation management challenge requiring creative solutions. But what made the spreadsheet truly damning was its correlation with academic outcomes. Every family with a score above 8.0 had children whose transcripts showed dramatic improvements during their time at Whitmore, regardless of their actual academic performance. Meanwhile, families with scores below 3.0, mostly scholarship recipients and middle-class families, paying full tuition without additional contributions, had children whose academic records remained unchanged or even declined. The folder contained email threads between Blackwood and his development team that revealed how systematically they managed these relationships. One exchange discussed academic intervention protocols for high-value families, which was administrator speak for coordinated grade fraud. Another outlined strategic scholarship allocation designed to maintain just enough legitimate academic excellence to preserve Whitmore's reputation, while ensuring maximum spots for wealthy students. Perhaps most disturbing were the college placement statistics. Whitmore's marketing materials boasted that 94% of graduates attended prestigious universities, but the internal documents revealed a different story. Of the students admitted to top-tier schools, nearly 70% came from families scoring above 7.0 on the development scale. Their admission wasn't based on academic merit, but on a carefully orchestrated system of recommendation letters, modified transcripts, and institutional connections that had nothing to do with education. The folder included correspondence with college admissions offices that made clear how these relationships worked. Mrs. Pemberton maintained ongoing dialogues with admissions counselors at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and other prestigious institutions. These weren't professional recommendations based on student merit. They were negotiations based on institutional relationships and implied future benefits. One email chain with a Harvard admissions officer discussed maintaining our pipeline and ensuring mutual benefit in our selection processes. Another with Princeton referenced the Morrison situation and confirmed that Emma's special circumstances had been appropriately communicated to the admissions committee. There was no mention of her academic qualifications, only references to her family's ongoing relationship with the university through their various foundations and political connections. But the most revealing document was a multi-year projection, showing how Whitmore planned to optimize family portfolio management over the next decade. It read like a business plan for monetizing education, with detailed strategies for cultivating relationships with wealthy families, managing their children's academic trajectories, and ensuring their continued financial support throughout. And Beyond their students' time at the school, the plan included provisions for legacy cultivation, ensuring that Whitmore graduates would send their own children to the school and continue the cycle of influence and corruption. It outlined how the institution would maintain relationships with alumni through their business ventures, political careers, and social connections, creating a network of mutual benefit that extended far beyond education. Hidden deeper in the folder were documents that revealed the true cost of this system. A budget analysis showed that maintaining the grade modification infrastructure required significant resources, additional administrative staff to manage false documentation, technology systems to track and coordinate changes, and legal consultation. To ensure the fraud remained undetectable, more troubling were the personnel costs. The document outlined bonuses paid to teachers and staff, who demonstrated flexibility in academic assessment and embraced collaborative approaches to student evaluation. In plain language, Whitmore was paying bribes to educators to participate. In academic fraud, the budget also included a line item for reputation management, which funded efforts to discredit anyone who might expose the system. This included legal fees for intimidating potential whistleblowers, public relations consultants to manage negative publicity, and investigation services to gather compromising information about critics. As I photographed each document, I realized I was uncovering not just institutional corruption, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that happened to operate within an educational institution. The money flowing through Whitmore wasn't just tuition and donations. It was payment for services that had nothing to do with learning and everything to do with perpetuating privilege. The paper trail revealed how completely the school had abandoned its educational mission. Students weren't being prepared for college through rigorous academics and character development. They were being processed through a system designed to deliver predetermined outcomes, regardless of their actual learning or growth. The donation. Records showed families essentially purchasing academic credentials for their children. With prices clearly established based on the level of intervention required, modest grade adjustments cost one amount, while complete academic makeovers demanded significantly higher investment levels. What struck me most was how coldly transactional it all was. These weren't educators making difficult decisions about how to help struggling students. These were administrators managing a business that happened to disguise itself as a school. The language throughout the documents was corporate, focused on customer satisfaction, market positioning, and competitive advantage rather than educational excellence or student development. Standing in Blackwood's office that night, surrounded by evidence of systematic educational fraud, I understood that what I'd discovered wasn't just corruption. It was the complete perversion of everything education was supposed to represent. Whitmore Academy had become a money laundering operation for privilege, ensuring that wealth could buy not just access to education, but the fraudulent credentials that would perpetuate that privilege across generations. The most heartbreaking discovery came 3 weeks after I'd found the donation records. While cleaning the college counseling office, I discovered a file that had been misfiled behind Mrs. Pemberton's desk, a thick folder labeled Scholarship Transitions that contained documentation of how Whitmore systematically destroyed the dreams of its most deserving students. The folder opened with a scholarship revocation notice for a student named David Chen, whose academic record was genuinely extraordinary. His transcript showed straight A's in advanced courses, leadership positions in 3 student organizations, and community service hours that exceeded graduation requirements by 200%. The revocation letter, however, painted a completely different picture. Due to ongoing concerns about David's social integration and alignment with Whitmore's community values, the notice read, "We have determined that his scholarship continuation would not serve his best interests or those of the institution." The language was carefully crafted to sound supportive while being deliberately vague about the actual reasons for his removal. But the supporting documents told the real story. David had questioned a grade he received in advanced biology, a C+ on an exam where he'd clearly demonstrated mastery of the material. When he requested to review his test, he discovered that his answers had been marked wrong, despite being correct. His subsequent complaints had been labeled as inability to accept feedback and disruptive behavior toward faculty. The file contained email exchanges between Mrs. Pemberton and David's teachers that revealed the systematic harassment designed to force him out. His essays were subjected to impossible standards marked down for lacking sophistication, despite demonstrating clear, critical thinking. His class participation was criticized as dominating discussion when scholarship students spoke up, While identical behavior from wealthy students was praised as natural leadership, most damning were the fabricated disciplinary incidents. David had been written up for aggressive behavior. After asking pointed questions during a class discussion about economic inequality, he was accused of academic dishonesty for collaborating on a project that explicitly required group work. Each incident was minor enough to seem plausible individually, but together they created a pattern that justified removing his scholarship. The folder contained similar documentation for 15 other scholarship students who had been counseled out over the past 3 years. Each file followed the same template: exceptional academic performance, followed by increasingly harsh grading, manufactured disciplinary problems, and eventual removal disguised as concern for the student's well-being. Maria Santos the same. Name from my daughter's class and the excellent essay I'd found at Whitmore had been particularly targeted. Her file showed consistent LFL work in her first semester, but her grades began declining dramatically after her parents questioned a disciplinary action. Her English teacher suddenly found her writing pedestrian and lacking insight. Math teacher discovered computational errors in work that was clearly correct. Her science labs were consistently marked down for insufficient analysis despite detailed reports that exceeded assignment requirements. The most cruel aspect was how the harassment was disguised as support. Maria was required to attend study skills workshops that conflicted with her part-time job, making it impossible for her family to meet their financial obligations. She was assigned to peer mentoring groups where wealthy students were paid to help her with work she already understood better than they did. These interventions were designed not to help her succeed, but to document her inability to take advantage of available resources. The breaking point came when Maria was accused of plagiarism on a history paper that was entirely her own work. The accusation was based on the claim that her analysis was too sophisticated for her background and must have been copied from sources she hadn't cited. When she provided detailed notes and drafts proving the work was original, she was written up for defensive behavior and inability to accept constructive criticism. Her scholarship was revoked 3 weeks before the end of her sophomore year, assuring that the credits she'd earned couldn't transfer easily and that she'd be forced to repeat coursework elsewhere. The termination letter expressed concern for Maria's emotional well-being and suggested that she might be happier in an environment better suited to her learning style. But perhaps the most devastating document in the folder was a strategic memo outlining Whitmore's scholarship optimization protocol. This wasn't accidental discrimination. It was deliberate policy designed to maintain just enough scholarship students to preserve the school's academic reputation. Admissions or recognition, the protocol called for admitting academically exceptional students from underrepresented backgrounds, but systematically removing them before they could disrupt established community dynamics or create unrealistic expectations among peer institutions. In plain language, Whitmore recruited brilliant students to boost its academic statistics, then eliminated them before they could actually benefit from the education they'd earned. The memo included specific quotas: no more than 3% of any graduating class could be scholarship students, and those who remained had to demonstrate appropriate gratitude and understanding of their role within the community. Scholarship recipients who showed excessive academic ambition or insufficient deference to institutional culture were flagged for removal. The financial calculations were coldly explicit. Each scholarship student cost the institution approximately $45,000 annually in lost tuition revenue. But their presence allowed Whitmore to maintain its academic ranking and attract the wealthy families who valued the school's reputation for excellence. The optimal strategy was to cycle through scholarship students quickly, gaining maximum benefit from their academic achievements while minimizing the long-term cost of their presence. The folder contained detailed profiles of current scholarship students, ranking them by sustainability risk. Students who questioned grades, challenged policies, or demonstrated excessive independence were marked for removal. Those who accepted their marginal status and showed appropriate deference were allowed to remain as long as they didn't interfere. With the advancement of wealthy students reading these files, I felt a rage that went beyond anything I'd experienced while discovering the grade modifications or donation schemes. Those corruptions affected wealthy students who were learning. That money could solve any problem. But this systematic destruction of scholarship students was something far more evil. It was the deliberate crushing of dreams. The calculated undermining of students whose only crime was being born into families without wealth or influence. These students had earned their places at Whitmore through genuine merit. They'd worked harder, overcome more obstacles, and demonstrated more character than their wealthy peers. Yet they were being systematically driven out, not despite their excellence, but because of it. Their success threatened the narrative that wealth and privilege were markers of inherent superiority. The psychological damage was immense. These students learned to doubt their own abilities, to assume that their struggles meant they weren't smart enough or strong enough for academic success. They internalized the message that their best efforts would never be sufficient, not realizing that the system was designed to ensure their failure regardless of their performance. As I photographed each heartbreaking document, I thought about Sarah and her unwavering belief in fairness. I thought about her potential future, about the possibility that her hard work and intelligence might someday lead her to an institution like Whitmore, only to face the same systematic destruction that these students had endured. The scholarship. Student files weren't just evidence of corruption. They were proof of educational evil. The systematic perversion of merit-based opportunity into a tool for perpetuating inequality and crushing the dreams of those who dared to believe that hard work and talent could overcome the circumstances of their birth. The faculty meeting minutes I discovered in Dr. Harrison's office revealed a truth more complex and disturbing than simple administrative corruption. These weren't just records of routine academic discussions, they were documentation of how good people were systematically corrupted, coerced, complicit in the destruction of educational integrity. The minutes, dating back 3 years, showed a clear progression from legitimate educational concerns to resigned acceptance of institutional fraud. The earliest entries revealed teachers who genuinely cared about their students and their craft, raising questions about grading inconsistencies and advocating for fair treatment of all students. Regardless of background, Dr. Harrison himself had initially been a voice of conscience. In a meeting from 2 years ago, he directly challenged Dean Mitchell about the apparent correlation between family donations and academic accommodations. His concerns were documented in careful detail. Dr. Harrison expressed reservations about recent grade modification requests, noting that several cases appear to circumvent established academic integrity policies. But the response to his concerns revealed how dissent was managed at Whitmore. The next month's minutes showed that Dr. Harrison had been assigned to a professional development committee focused on evolving assessment methodologies and embracing flexible evaluation frameworks. He was being retrained to see fraud as progress. Mrs. Foster from the English department had raised similar concerns about the quality of work she was being asked to accept from certain students. Her original comments were passionate and principled. We cannot maintain academic standards while simultaneously ignoring them for select students. This undermines the value of education for all our students. The administration's response was swift and systematic. Mrs. Foster was enrolled in workshops on differentiated instruction and culturally responsive teaching, was assigned a mentor from the college counseling office to help her better understand the diverse needs of Whitmore families. Most tellingly, her class rosters were quietly adjusted to include more students from high donor families, forcing her to either compromise her standards or face constant conflict with administration. The minutes showed how this pressure wore down even the most principled educators. Mrs. Foster's comments became increasingly cautious over time. Perhaps we need to consider alternative assessment methods that better reflect diverse learning styles, replaced her earlier direct challenges to grade modifications. She was learning to speak the language of educational justification for practices she knew were corrupt. But not all teachers succumbed to pressure through professional development and administrative manipulation. Some faced more direct coercion, as revealed in a particularly disturbing set of minutes from 8 months ago. Ms. Rodriguez, the history teacher I'd seen being pushed out for refusing to participate in grade fraud, had made a final stand that was both brave and heartbreaking. According to the minutes, she'd presented evidence of systematic grade modifications to the full faculty, arguing that we have a professional and moral obligation to maintain academic integrity regardless of external pressures. Response from administration was swift and brutal. The minutes showed that Dean Mitchell had questioned Ms. Rodriguez's commitment to student success and her flexibility in meeting diverse learning needs. Headmaster Blackwood had suggested that her rigid approach to assessment was inconsistent with Whitmore's mission of individualized education, but the most chilling detail was how other faculty members responded to Ms. Rodriguez's courage. Instead of supporting her, most remained silent. A few actively criticized her for creating unnecessary conflict and not being a team player. The teacher who should have been hailed as a hero for defending educational integrity was isolated and blamed for disrupting the comfortable corruption that everyone had learned to were devastating. She'd made one last attempt to appeal to her colleagues' consciences. We became teachers to help students learn and grow, not to sell them fraudulent credentials. Every time we modify a grade for the wrong reasons, we betray every student who earned their grades honestly. Plea fell on deaf ears. The minutes recorded several teachers expressing concern about Ms. Rodriguez's negative attitude and suggesting that her inflexibility was harmful to school culture. These were educators who had once shared her values, but who had been so thoroughly corrupted by the system that they now viewed integrity as a threat. The documentation of Ms. Rodriguez's termination process revealed how systematically Whitmore destroyed teachers who couldn't be corrupted. Her student evaluations were suddenly filled with complaints that mirrored administrative talking points. Her lesson plans were criticized for being too rigid and not sufficiently differentiated. Her classroom management was questioned despite years of successful teaching. Most insidiously, the administration arranged for her to teach several students from high-donor families who had been coached to be deliberately disruptive. When she attempted to maintain classroom discipline, she was written up for inability to manage diverse learning styles, creating a hostile environment for students from different backgrounds. The faculty meeting minutes showed how other teachers watched this systematic destruction in silence. Some expressed private sympathy for Ms. Rodriguez, but none were willing to support her publicly. They had families to support, mortgages to pay, and careers to protect. The message was clear: challenge the system, and you'll be destroyed professionally and personally. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the minutes was how they revealed the psychological mechanisms that allowed good people to participate in corruption. Teachers weren't asked to suddenly abandon their principles. They were gradually led to reframe their compromises as educational progress. Grade modifications became accommodated assessments. Academic fraud was rebranded as individualized evaluation criteria. The systematic persecution of scholarship students was described as ensuring appropriate placement for student success. The language of progressive education was weaponized to make corruption sound like compassion. The minutes showed teachers gradually adopting this corrupted vocabulary, learning to justify their compromises through educational buzzwords that obscured the reality of what they were doing. They convinced themselves that they were serving students' needs rather than wealthy families' demands. Some teachers found ways to maintain their dignity within the corrupt system. Dr. Martinez, from the science department, had developed what he called creative compliance, technically following administrative directives, while preserving as much academic integrity as possible. His approach was documented in the minutes as a model for others: participate enough to avoid being targeted, but maintain personal standards wherever possible. Others, like Coach Williams, embraced the corruption wholeheartedly. The minutes showed him advocating for even more flexibility in academic standards and suggesting that successful families understand what it takes to achieve results. He'd completely internalized the institution's values, viewing corruption as pragmatic rather than problematic. Reading these faculty meeting minutes, I understood that Whitmore's corruption wasn't just about administrators and wealthy families. It was about the systematic destruction of professional integrity among educators who had once believed in their mission. These teachers weren't villains. They were victims of a system designed to corrupt or eliminate anyone with principles. The tragedy was that many of these educators still believed they were serving students, even as they participated in practices that undermined everything education was supposed to represent. They'd been so thoroughly manipulated that they couldn't see how completely they'd betrayed their own values and their students' trust. The letter that broke my heart and steeled my resolve was hidden in a stack of old files in the guidance office, tucked away like evidence of a crime that administration wanted to forget. It was written in the careful handwriting of a 17-year-old girl named Jessica Martinez, a scholarship student who had discovered the truth about Whitmore's corruption and paid the ultimate price for her courage. The letter was addressed to her younger sister Sophia, who was scheduled to start at Whitmore the following year on a scholarship she'd earned through exceptional academic performance. Jessica had written it as a warning, a desperate attempt to protect someone she loved from the systematic destruction she'd endured. "Dear Sophia," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone from Whitmore, and you'll be hearing there version of why I left. I'll tell you I couldn't handle the academic pressure, that I had behavioral problems, that I wasn't a good fit for the Whitmore community. I need you to know the truth before they try to destroy you the way they destroyed me." Jessica went on to describe her experience with devastating clarity. She'd arrived at Whitmore with straight A's, perfect attendance, and dreams of becoming the first person in her family to attend college. Her first semester had been everything she'd hoped, for challenging classes, inspiring teachers, and the kind of academic environment she'd never had access to before. But everything changed when she started asking questions about the disparities. She observed, why did some students receive extensions on assignments while others were penalized for being even a few minutes late? Why were certain students excused from consequences while others faced harsh discipline for minor infractions? Why did her own excellent work receive lower grades than inferior assignments from her wealthy classmates? At first I thought I was imagining things, Jessica wrote. I told myself that maybe I didn't understand how private schools worked, that maybe these differences were normal. But when I started paying closer attention, I realized it wasn't my imagination. There really were two different sets of rules, one for students like me, and another for everyone else. Jessica's letter detailed how she'd begun documenting the inconsistencies she observed. She'd kept copies of her assignments alongside those of other students, noting how identical work received dramatically different grades depending on who submitted it. She'd recorded conversations where teachers made comments about certain students needing to work twice as hard to prove themselves, while other students deserved the benefit of the doubt. The breaking point came when Jessica witnessed a clear case of academic fraud. During a chemistry exam, she'd seen Bradley Whitman, whose modified grades I'd discovered weeks earlier, cheating blatantly. He'd used his phone to look up answers, copied from another student's paper, and even asked the teacher direct questions about test content during the exam. Jessica had reported the incident to the teacher, Dr. Peterson, expecting that academic integrity policies would be enforced. Instead, she was told that she'd misunderstood what she'd observed and that making false accusations against fellow students was a serious disciplinary matter. "They turned it around on me," Jessica wrote. To her sister, "Suddenly, I was the problem for reporting cheating, not Bradley for actually cheating. Dr. Peterson said I was being vindictive, that my allegations showed poor character, an inability to work collaboratively with peers. The retaliation was swift and systematic." Jessica's subsequent assignments in chemistry were graded harshly, with points deducted for minor formatting issues that were ignored in other students' work. Her participation in class discussions was criticized as dominating and inconsiderate. Of others, while identical behavior from wealthy students was praised as leadership. But Jessica's real mistake was refusing to back down. When she appealed her chemistry grade, she was told by Dean Mitchell that she was showing concerning behavioral patterns and needed to focus on her own performance rather than critiquing others. When she asked to speak with Headmaster Blackwood about the academic integrity issues she'd observed, she was scheduled for counseling sessions to address her adjustment difficulties and tendency toward paranoid thinking. The letter revealed how Whitmore's administration had systematically destroyed Jessica's academic record and reputation. Her grades in other subjects suddenly began declining as teachers received guidance about her concerning behavior and need for appropriate boundaries. Her college recommendation letters, which she managed to see through a clerical error, painted her as an intelligent but troubled student with interpersonal difficulties and resistance to authority. Most heartbreakingly, Jessica described how the psychological pressure had affected her family. Her parents, who spoke limited English and had no experience with private school culture, told that Jessica was struggling with behavioral issues that required intervention. They were made to feel that their daughter's problems were their fault, that they hadn't prepared her for the demands of an elite educational environment. "They convinced my parents that I was the problem," Jessica wrote. "Mom started crying every night, thinking she'd failed as a mother. Dad worked extra shifts to pay for the counseling sessions they said I needed. They blamed themselves for my difficulties at school, never realizing that the school was systematically destroying me." The final blow came when Jessica was accused of plagiarism on her senior thesis, a project she'd worked on for months, and that presented some of the best writing she'd ever done. The accusation was based on the claim that her analysis was too sophisticated for someone with her background and must have been copied from graduate-level sources. When Jessica provided detailed outlines, drafts, and research notes proving the work was entirely her own, she was written up for defensive behavior and inability to accept feedback. The plagiarism accusation remained on her record. destroying any chance of admission to competitive colleges and effectively ending her academic dreams. They didn't just kick me out, Jessica wrote to Sophia. They made sure I could never recover from what they did to me. My transcript shows academic dishonesty. My recommendation letters suggest behavioral problems. College admissions offices will see me as a troubled student who couldn't handle academic pressure, not as someone who is systematically destroyed for refusing to stay silent about corruption. The letter's conclusion was both desperate and prophetic. Sophia, I'm begging you not to accept that scholarship. I know how much it means to our family. I know how hard you've worked to earn it. Well, but they will destroy you the way they destroyed me. They can't allow students like us to succeed because our success exposes the lie that wealth equals merit. Please, please find another way to get your education. Don't let them do to you what they did to me. At the bottom of the letter was a heartbreaking postscript. If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, please tell Mom and Dad that none of this was their fault. Tell them I love them, and I'm sorry I couldn't be strong enough to survive what Whitmore did to our family. The file containing Jessica's letter also included a newspaper clipping from 6 months later. Jessica Martinez, age 17, had died by suicide 2 weeks after being expelled from Whitmore Academy. Brief article described her as a troubled student who had struggled with academic pressure and behavioral issues. There was no mention of the systematic persecution that had driven her to despair, no investigation into the institutional practices that had destroyed a brilliant young woman's future. The school's official statement, it's included in the file, expressed sympathy for the Martinez family during this difficult time and noted that Jessica had been receiving appropriate counseling support for her academic and personal challenges. It was a masterpiece of institutional cover-up, transforming a victim of systematic abuse into a student who simply couldn't cope with normal academic demands. Reading Jessica's letter in the empty guidance office, felt something break inside me. This wasn't just about grade modifications or college admissions fraud anymore. This was about a system so corrupt, so callous, that it would drive a 17-year-old girl to suicide rather than admit its own wrongdoing. Jessica Martinez had died trying to protect her sister from the same destruction she'd endured. Her letter was both testimony to her courage and evidence of Whitmore's absolute moral bankruptcy. The institution had murdered her spirit as surely as if they'd pulled a trigger, and had the audacity to blame her death on her own weakness. Thought about Sarah, about her essay on justice, about her belief that speaking up about wrongdoing was a moral obligation. Jessica had spoken up, and it had cost her everything. But her silence would have cost even more her integrity, her self-respect, and ultimately her life anyway. Just more slowly, standing in that office, holding the letter of a dead girl who had died trying to protect others from institutional evil, I knew that my time for passive observation was over. Jessica Martinez had paid the ultimate price for Whitmore's corruption. The least I could do was ensure that her death would finally expose the truth she'd died trying to reveal. Jessica Martinez's letter had transformed me from a reluctant observer into a determined investigator. Her death gave me a mission that transcended my own job security or personal safety, owed it to her memory. And to Sophia Martinez, who was still scheduled to start at Whitmore in the fall, to document the systematic corruption that had killed a brilliant young woman, I began carrying a small digital camera to work, hidden in my cleaning supplies. The device was barely larger than a credit card, but capable of recording high-definition video with audio technology that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier, but was now available at any electronics store for less than $100. My documentation strategy became methodical and comprehensive. Every Wednesday night, I positioned myself strategically during those mysterious faculty meetings, using my cleaning routine as cover to record conversations. That revealed the inner workings of Whitmore's corruption. The first recording I captured was explosive. Dean Mitchell was explaining to the assembled group how to handle a situation involving a scholarship student named Marcus Thompson, not me, but a junior whose academic excellence was threatening to expose the disparity in how students were treated. Marcus is showing the same patterns we saw with the Martinez girl, Mitchell said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone discussing a business problem rather than a human being. Exceptional academic performance, tendency to question inconsistencies, inability to understand his place in the community dynamic. The conversation that followed was a blueprint for systematic destruction. Dr. Harrison, the same teacher whose meeting minutes had shown his gradual corruption, suggested implementing more rigorous evaluation criteria for Marcus's work. Mrs. Pemberton recommended adjusting his course load to better match his preparation level, which everyone understood meant removing him from advanced classes, where his performance made wealthy students look inadequate. Most chillingly, Headmaster Blackwood discussed managing family expectations by having conversations with Marcus's parents about his social adjustment challenges and potential behavioral concerns. They were planning to gaslight his family the same way they'd destroyed Jessica Martinez's parents. But they made one crucial mistake during that meeting. They revealed the existence of what they called the system. Dean Mitchell mentioned needing to check the tracking protocols and ensure that all documentation followed established patterns. When Dr. Harrison asked about the memory card backups, my blood ran cold as I realized they were maintaining their own secret recordings of these planning sessions. The next week, I took an enormous risk. Using my master key access during a late-night shift, I searched Dean Mitchell's office until I found what I was looking for. A small safe hidden behind a bookshelf, secured with a combination lock that I managed to crack using her birth date. Information from personnel files I'd observed. Inside the safe was a collection of memory cards labeled by academic year, along with detailed written logs of every intervention they'd implemented. The cards contained audio recordings of their Wednesday night planning sessions going back 3 years, comprehensive documentation of systematic academic fraud, student persecution, and institutional corruption. But what made these recordings truly damning was how clearly they revealed the administrators' awareness that their actions were illegal and immoral. They spoke explicitly about maintaining plausible deniability, ensuring no paper trails, and protecting the institution from liability. They discussed individual students like chess pieces to be moved or removed based on institutional convenience. The recording from the night Jessica Martinez was targeted was particularly devastating. The administrators discussed her problematic tendency toward truth-telling and her dangerous influence on other scholarship students. They planned her destruction with the same casual efficiency they might use to plan a school event. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Blackwood's voice said on the recording. "If she continues gathering evidence, she could create real problems for us. It's better to remove her quickly and deal with any family concerns afterward." Dean Mitchell's response revealed the depths of their callousness. The plagiarism accusation should be sufficient. "We've used it successfully before, and it's nearly impossible to disprove. Her academic record will be destroyed, and she'll be too discredited to cause further problems." They discussed Jessica's eventual suicide with chilling prescience. Mrs. Pemberton noted that students like her often struggle with failure, and that removing academic opportunities tends to resolve behavioral problems permanently. They knew exactly what they were doing to vulnerable young people, and they simply didn't care about the human cost. But the recordings also revealed something equally important: the names and details of other students who had been targeted, parents who had been manipulated, and teachers who had been coerced into participating. This wasn't isolated corruption, it was a systematic program of educational destruction that had affected hundreds of families over the years. The memory cards contained evidence of grade modifications worth millions of dollars in fraudulent college admissions, documentation of bribery and extortion involving faculty members, proof of conspiracy to commit fraud at the federal level through falsified educational records. As I copied each recording to my own devices, I was gathering evidence of crimes that extended far beyond Whitmore Academy. The college admissions fraud involved universities across the country. Modifications affected federal financial aid programs, and the systematic discrimination violated numerous civil rights laws. But I also understood the enormous personal risk I was taking. These recordings proved that Whitmore's administrators were capable of destroying anyone who threatened their system. They had driven Jessica Martinez to suicide and were planning to do the same to other students. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy a janitor who had uncovered their secrets. The recordings revealed how they handled previous threats to their operation. A teacher who had tried to expose grade fraud 3 years earlier had been fired and blacklisted from other schools through false references. A parent who had questioned disciplinary practices had found their business subjected to mysterious regulatory investigations and tax audits. A journalist who had started asking questions about scholarship. Student retention rates had been discredited through planted evidence of professional misconduct. Each case followed the same pattern: identify the threat, gather compromising information, coordinate a systematic campaign of professional and personal destruction, then ensure the victim was too damaged to be credible if they continued speaking out. As I completed my covert documentation that night, carefully returning everything to its original position, I knew I had crossed a point of no return. The evidence I'd gathered was comprehensive enough to destroy Whitmore's corrupt system, but possessing it also made me a target for the same treatment that had killed Jessica Martinez. The memory cards hidden in my cleaning supplies contained more than just recordings. They held the power to expose a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. But they also represented a death sentence if discovered, as the administrators had made clear through their casual discussions of how to eliminate threats to their operation. Walking out of Whitmore that night, I felt the weight of Jessica Martinez's letter in one pocket and the hidden camera containing evidence of systematic corruption in another. I was no longer just a janitor observing injustice. I was a witness carrying proof of institutional evil. I finally understood what Jessica had meant when she wrote about the courage required to speak truth to power. The question now wasn't whether I had enough evidence to expose Whitmore's corruption, it was whether I could survive long enough to ensure that evidence reached the right people before the institution destroyed me, the way it had destroyed so many others. The discovery that shattered my understanding of Whitmore's corruption came when I found a folder marked External Relations hidden in Headmaster Blackwood's personal filing cabinet. Inside were email printouts that revealed the school's fraud wasn't an isolated operation. It was part of a vast network of corruption that extended through the highest levels of American higher education. The correspondence began with what appeared to be routine communication between Mrs. Pemberton and admissions officers at prestigious universities. But as I read deeper, I realized these weren't professional recommendations based on student merit. They were carefully coded negotiations for admission slots that had been essentially purchased through Whitmore's donor relationships. An email chain with Harvard's admissions office discussed maintaining our traditional pipeline and ensuring appropriate consideration for Whitmore candidates who represent long-term institutional relationships. The language was diplomatic. The meaning was clear. Harvard was reserving admission spots for Whitmore students, whose families could provide significant financial benefit to both institutions. The correspondence with Princeton was even more explicit. An email from their admissions director referenced the Morrison Understanding and confirmed that Emma Morrison's special circumstances had been appropriately weighted in our evaluation process. There was no mention of her academic qualifications only. Acknowledgement that her father's political influence and family foundation's donations had secured her admission despite academic performance. That would have disqualified any other applicant, but the most damning document was a deed spreadsheet titled Institutional Partnership Matrix that mapped out relationships between Whitmore and 23 elite universities. Each institution was listed with specific contact persons, annual coordination meetings, and numerical targets for student placements based on family donation levels. The matrix revealed a systematic bartering system where admission slots were traded like commodities. Whitmore guaranteed Harvard for students annually from families, giving over $500,000, while Harvard provided consultation services on maintaining academic rankings, despite questionable admission practices. Princeton received 3 guaranteed placements in exchange for providing guest speakers and lending academic credibility to Whitmore's programs. Yale's arrangement was particularly sophisticated. They accepted 6 Whitmore students annually, but required the school to maintain specific diversity statistics to protect Yale's own reputation. This explained why Whitmore recruited exceptional scholarship students not to educate them, but to inflate diversity numbers that would justify accepting wealthy, white students whose qualifications were marginal at best. The correspondence revealed how universities actively participated in maintaining these arrangements. Admissions officers provided feedback on which students were marketable based on family connections rather than academic merit. They suggested modifications to transcripts and recommendation letters that would make weak candidates appear more attractive. Most disturbing were the emails discussing problem management. When students or families threatened to expose the system, a Yale admissions officer had written to Mrs. Pemberton about a parent who was questioning why their academically superior child had been rejected, while clearly inferior candidates from donor families were accepted. Response to the Chen inquiry, the email read, "Their documentation is uncomfortably thorough. and they seem to understand the correlation between donation levels and admission outcomes. Suggest implementing standard protocol for motivated parents' academic readiness concerns, cultural fit questions, etc. The standard protocol was revealed in subsequent emails as a systematic campaign to gaslight parents into believing their children weren't qualified for admission. Universities would cite vague concerns about academic preparation, leadership potential, or community fit that were impossible to challenge or disprove. If parents persisted in their complaints, the emails showed how institutions coordinated to ensure the family was blacklisted from other elite schools. Information was shared between admissions offices to ensure that problem families faced rejection everywhere they applied, regardless of their children's qualifications. The correspondence included specific instructions for handling media inquiries. In potential investigations, universities maintained prepared statements about their holistic admissions processes and commitment to diversity and merit. They had rehearsed responses for questions about donor influence and coordinated strategies for discrediting anyone who attempted to expose the system. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was how the corruption extended beyond college admissions into graduate programs, internships, and career placement. The emails discussed pipeline management that ensured wealthy students received preferential treatment throughout their educational and professional development. Medical school admissions were coordinated through the same network. Seats reserved for students whose families could provide research funding or hospital donations. Law school placements were arranged based on families' political connections and potential future influence. Business school admissions were tied to family companies, recruitment, relationships, and alumni donation potential. The network even extended into professional licensing and certification. Bar exam results were influenced through family connections. 2 state bar associations. Medical licensing boards received consultation about candidates whose families had provided significant support to regulatory organizations. The emails revealed how this system perpetuated itself across generations. Students who benefited from fraudulent admissions became alumni who donated to maintain the system for their own children. They joined admission committees, served on university boards, and used their purchased credentials to gain positions of influence that protected the corruption from exposure. The correspondence included detailed financial calculations showing how much revenue each university generated through these arrangements. Tuition from unqualified wealthy students was supplemented by family donations, research grants, building funds, and ongoing legacy contributions that dwarfed any revenue from legitimate merit-based admissions. Most cynically, the emails showed how universities used legitimate high-achieving students as cover for their corrupt practices. Outstanding scholarship recipients and academically exceptional candidates provided statistical cover that allowed institutions to maintain their rankings while admitting significant numbers of unqualified wealthy students. The network maintained detailed profiles of journalists, regulators, and potential whistleblowers who might threaten their operations. They shared information about problem individuals and coordinated responses to any investigations or media inquiries. They had prepared strategies for discrediting critics and protecting institutional reputations. Reading through these emails, I understood that Whitmore's corruption wasn't an isolated case of institutional failure. It was a single node in a vast network of educational fraud that had infected the highest levels of American academia. The very institutions that Americans trusted to identify and reward merit had been completely corrupted by wealth and influence. The elite university system had become a money laundering operation for privilege, ensuring that wealth could purchase not just access to education, but the fraudulent credentials that would perpetuate that privilege across generations. Every legitimate student who was rejected to make room for an unqualified wealthy candidate wasn't just losing an educational opportunity. They were being excluded from a system that determined access to professional success and social influence. The network's corruption explained why social mobility in America had declined so dramatically. When merit-based admission to elite institutions was systematically undermined by wealth and influence, talented individuals from working class families were excluded from the educational pathways that led to positions of power and influence. As I photographed each damning email, I realized I was documenting more than institutional corruption. I was uncovering evidence of a systematic betrayal of American meritocracy. The emails proved that the entire elite education system was fraudulent, designed not to identify and develop talent, but to launder privilege and ensure that wealth and influence would triumph over character and ability. The correspondence in that folder represented the death certificate of educational integrity in America, proof that the institutions Americans trusted most had abandoned their mission in favor of serving the wealthy families who could afford to purchase their children's futures. The threatening note appeared in my employee locker on a Thursday morning in early November, tucked between my timesheets and work schedule like a routine administrative memo. But there was nothing routine about the message printed on Whitmore Academy letterhead in official school fonts. Employees who focus on their assigned duties enjoy long, stable careers at Whitmore. Those who develop interests beyond their responsibilities often find themselves facing unexpected challenges in their personal and professional lives. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. The note wasn't signed, but the message was unmistakably clear. They knew I'd been investigating, and they were prepared to destroy me if I continued. My hands shook as I read it, not from fear for myself, but from the terrible realization that my actions might have put Sarah at risk. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table trying to act normal while Sarah worked on her homework, but my mind was racing through possibilities. How much did they know? Had they seen me copying documents or discovered my hidden camera? More importantly, what would they do to protect their criminal enterprise? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next afternoon, Sarah came home from school unusually quiet, her typical cheerful energy replaced by something that looked like confusion mixed with hurt. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her backpack still on, "something weird happened at school today." My stomach clenched. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor, called me into her office. She said she'd received some concerns about my home situation and wanted to make sure I was doing okay. The blood drained from my face. They were targeting my daughter, using the same tactics they'd employed against Jessica Martinez's family. "What kind of concerns?" Sarah frowned, clearly troubled by the conversation. "She asked a lot of questions about whether you were under stress lately, whether you'd been acting differently at home, whether I felt safe and supported. She kept asking if there were any changes in our family situation or if I needed anyone to talk to about problems at home." Sophistication of their attack was breathtaking. By targeting Sarah through her school counselor, as concerned professionals looking out for a child's welfare, if I continued my investigation, they could escalate to Child Protective Services based on educator concerns about my mental state and its impact on Sarah's well-being. "What did you tell her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I told her you were the best dad in the world and that we were doing great," Sarah said with fierce loyalty. "But Dad," she seemed like she already had her mind made up about something. "She kept taking notes even when I was saying good things about you." That night, after Sarah went to bed, I found myself walking through our small house, looking at everything with new eyes. This was what I stood to lose if Whitmore decided to escalate their campaign against me. Not just my job or my reputation, but my daughter, the only thing in the world that mattered more than exposing their corruption. The psychological pressure was exactly what they intended. I found myself second-guessing every interaction with Sarah, wondering if my stress about Whitmore was affecting her in ways I hadn't noticed. Was she eating enough? Sleeping well? Had my investigation made me a worse father? The self-doubt was insidious and intentional. But 2 days later, something happened that crystallized my resolve instead of weakening it. I was cleaning the administrative offices when I overheard Dean Mitchell on a phone call that made my blood run cold. "The Thompson situation requires careful management," she was saying. "He's shown concerning patterns staying late, accessing areas outside his normal duties, asking inappropriate questions. We need to document these behaviors carefully before taking action." She paused, listening to the response from whoever was on the other end of the call. "Yes, we've initiated preliminary inquiries through his daughter's school. The guidance counselor is building a file on family instability and potential neglect indicators. If he continues to be problematic, we'll have the documentation needed to involve Child Protective Services." The casual way she discussed destroying my family was more chilling than any direct threat could have been. This wasn't passionate retaliation. It was clinical calculation, the same methodical approach they'd used to destroy Jessica Martinez and countless other students who had threatened their system. "The beauty of this approach," Mitchell continued, "is that it neutralizes the threat while appearing to protect a vulnerable child. Even if he has gathered some information about institutional practices, His credibility will be destroyed by questions about his mental state and parental fitness. I stood frozen in the hallway, cleaning supplies in hand, listening to them plan the destruction of everything I cared about. But instead of terrorizing me into submission, their callousness ignited a fury that burned away my fear. They had made a crucial miscalculation. By threatening Sarah, they had crossed a line that transformed me from a reluctant whistleblower into someone with nothing left to lose. They could destroy my career, ruin my reputation, even threaten my freedom, but threatening my daughter meant war. That night, sat down and wrote Sarah a letter similar to the one Jessica Martinez had written to her sister. If something happened to me, I wanted Sarah to understand why I had taken the risks I was about to take. I wanted her to know that sometimes adults have to make hard choices to protect other people's children, even when it means risking their own safety. But I also made a different choice than Jessica had made. Instead of trying to fight the system alone, I decided to find allies who could help me expose Whitmore's corruption while protecting my family from retaliation. The next morning, I began researching investigative journalists, law enforcement, agencies, and civil rights organizations that had experience handling institutional corruption cases. I needed to find people who understood how systems like Whitmore operated and had the resources to take on powerful institutions that would stop at nothing to protect their criminal enterprises. The threatening note in my locker had been intended to silence me through fear. Instead, it had provided crucial evidence of criminal conspiracy and witness intimidation. Combined with the recordings I'd gathered and the documents I'd photographed, it painted a picture of an organization that knew its actions were illegal and was prepared to commit additional crimes to avoid accountability. More importantly, their decision to target Sarah had revealed the depths of their moral bankruptcy. An institution that would threaten a 12-year-old girl to protect its corruption was an institution that needed to be destroyed, regardless of the personal cost. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most dangerous phase of my investigation, I kept thinking about Jessica Martinez's letter and her warning to her sister about the price of fighting institutional evil. She had been right about the personal cost, but she had also been right about the moral obligation. To protect others from the same destruction, the threatening note tucked in my locker wasn't just evidence of Whitmore's criminal behavior, was proof that they viewed me as enough of a threat to risk exposing their tactics. That meant I was close enough to the truth to hurt them, and that made everything I'd endured worthwhile. They had threatened my daughter to protect their system of educational fraud. I would use every piece of evidence I'd gathered to ensure that their system, and everyone who participated in it, faced the justice that Jessica Martinez had died trying to achieve. My unlikely ally revealed herself on a Friday evening in late November, when I was working alone in the library and heard soft footsteps behind me.
Oh.
I turned to find Dr. Elena Rodriguez, not the history teacher who had been fired, but the school librarian who had worked at Whitmore for over 15 years and whom I'd barely noticed during my months of investigation. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were alone, "I think we need to talk." My heart raced as I wondered if this was another trap, another way for the administration to gather evidence of my concerning behavior. But something in her eyes, a mixture of sadness, determination, and barely contained anger, made me pause. "I know what you've been doing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I know why." She led me to a corner of the library where the security cameras had a blind spot, a location she'd clearly chosen deliberately. From her bag, she pulled out a worn leather journal that looked like it had been carried and referenced countless times. "This belonged to my predecessor, Mrs. Catherine Wells," she said, holding the journal carefully. "She was the librarian here. For 23 years before she died of a heart attack 3 years ago, everyone said it was sudden, unexpected, but I think the stress of what she discovered at Whitmore killed her as surely as if they'd pulled a trigger." Dr. Rodriguez opened the journal to pages filled with meticulous handwriting, dates, and detailed observations. "Catherine was like you. She noticed things that didn't add up. She started documenting inconsistencies in 2018. Not long after, she realized that certain students had access to resources and accommodations that others were denied. The journal entries were devastating in their careful precision," Mrs. Wells had noted. "How specific students were allowed to use library computers to complete assignments during exams, effectively giving them unlimited time and access to information that other students couldn't use. She documented how certain families' children had papers pre-researched by graduate student tutors who were paid through foundation grants that seemed designed to circumvent academic integrity policies. Catherine tried to report what she was seeing, Dr. Rodriguez explained. She went to the department heads, then to the administration, then to the board. Each time, she was told she was misunderstanding the situation or that she needed to be more flexible in accommodating diverse learning styles. The journal showed how Mrs. Wells had been systematically marginalized and isolated for her attempts to maintain library policies equally for all students. Her requests for updated books and technology were denied, while the administration approved expensive renovations to facilities used primarily by wealthy students. Her recommendations for academic integrity resources were rejected, while the school invested in tutoring programs that amounted to academic fraud. The breaking point came when Catherine discovered the document destruction. Dr. Rodriguez continued, turning to entries from Mrs. Wells' final months at Whitmore. She found out that student records were being systematically altered and that evidence of the original documents was being eliminated. Mrs. Wells had discovered that the library's digital archives contained backup copies of student transcripts, disciplinary records, and college recommendation letters that contradicted the official versions in students' files. The electronic records showed the original grades before modification, the actual disciplinary incidents before they were expunged or minimized, and the honest assessments before they were rewritten to favor wealthy students. She made copies of everything. Dr. Rodriguez said, hundreds of documents proving systematic academic fraud going back over a decade. She was planning to take them to the state education department and the FBI. The journal's final entries revealed Mrs. Wells' growing desperation and isolation. She'd been reassigned to menial tasks, excluded from faculty meetings, and subjected to performance reviews that questioned her competence despite decades of exemplary service. The stress had begun affecting her health: sleepless nights, chest pains, difficulty concentrating. The night before she died, Catherine called me, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice thick with emotion. She said she'd finally gathered enough evidence to expose everything, that she was going to contact authorities the next morning. She asked me to meet her early to help organize the documentation. But Mrs. Wells never made it to that meeting. She suffered a massive heart attack at home that night, dying alone with boxes of evidence that would disappear before her body was discovered. When I arrived at school the next morning, I found maintenance workers cleaning out Catherine's office. Dr. Rodriguez continued. They said it was standard procedure, but they were destroying everything: files, documents, even her personal items. When I asked about the materials she'd been collecting, I was told that Mrs. Wells had been suffering from paranoid delusions and that her conspiracy theories were evidence of mental illness. Dr. Rodriguez had managed to save only Mrs. Wells' journal, which had been hidden in her personal desk drawer. Everything else, the copied transcripts, the documented evidence of grade modifications, the proof of systematic academic fraud, had been eliminated before it could reach investigators. They killed her, Dr. Rodriguez said simply. Maybe not directly, but they created the stress that stopped her heart, and then they destroyed her reputation by claiming she was mentally unstable. The journal contained Mrs. Wells' growing awareness that she was being watched and that her investigation had been discovered. She documented how her computer access was restricted, how files she'd copied were mysteriously deleted, and how administrators had begun questioning her about her research interests and personal projects. Catherine wrote about feeling like she was being hunted, Dr. Rodriguez explained. She knew they were planning to silence her, but she thought she could get the evidence out before they stopped her. The final entry in the journal was dated the day before Mrs. Wells died. If something happens to me, if they succeed in silencing me, I pray that someone else will have the courage to continue this fight. These students deserve better. The truth deserves to be told. The corruption must be exposed, no matter the personal cost. Dr. Rodriguez closed the journal and looked at me with eyes that held 3 years of accumulated grief and rage. I saw you starting to ask the same questions Catherine had asked, following the same patterns she'd followed. I knew history was repeating itself. But I also knew I couldn't let them destroy another good person the way they destroyed her. She explained how she'd been watching my investigation, noting the nights when I stayed late in certain offices, recognizing the signs of someone who was uncovering uncomfortable truths. She'd seen the threatening note in my locker she had, her own master key as head librarian, and had witnessed the phone calls about targeting Sarah through her school. "I've been documenting their surveillance of you," she said, pulling out her own carefully maintained files. "Every meeting they've had about the Thompson situation, every plan they've made to discredit you, every tactic they've discussed for destroying your family. I learned from Catherine's mistake I'm not working alone this time." Dr. Rodriguez revealed that she'd been building her own network of allies, including other staff members who had noticed the corruption, parents who had been victimized by the system, and former students who had been pushed out unfairly. She'd also been in contact with investigative journalists and law enforcement agencies, preparing the groundwork for a coordinated exposure that would be impossible to suppress. "Catherine died trying to fight the system alone," she said. "You don't have to. We're going to finish what she started, and we're going to make sure that her death wasn't meaningless." Looking at Mrs. Wells' journal, filled with the careful observations of a woman who had died trying to protect students from institutional corruption, I understood that I was part of something larger than my own investigation. I was continuing a fight that had cost Catherine Wells her life, carrying forward the evidence that Jessica Martinez had died trying to expose. The journal wasn't just historical documentation, it was a call to action from beyond the grave. A reminder that the corruption at Whitmore had been destroying lives for years, and would continue destroying lives until someone had the courage to stop it. Permanently, Dr. Rodriguez had given me something more valuable than evidence she'd given me hope that this fight could be won, and the knowledge that I wasn't facing Whitmore's institutional evil alone. Dr. Rodriguez and I met 3 nights later in her home office, a cozy room lined with books that felt like a sanctuary after months of navigating Whitmore's hostile environment. She'd invited 2 other people to join our planning session, whose involvement proved that the corruption's impact extended far beyond the school's walls. The first was Janet Morrison, a lawyer whose daughter had attended Whitmore 5 years earlier. Not Senator Morrison's family, but a middle-class family whose bright daughter had been systematically destroyed by the same tactics I'd witnessed being used against scholarship students. Emma was valedictorian material when she started at Whitmore, Janet explained, her professional composure barely containing years of suppressed anger. Straight A's, perfect attendance, genuine love of learning, but she wasn't from a donor family, and that made her dangerous to their system. Janet's daughter had faced the same escalating persecution that had driven Jessica Martinez to suicide, harsh grading, manufactured disciplinary problems, and systematic exclusion from opportunities. When Janet had tried to address the disparities legally, she'd discovered how completely the system protected itself. "I filed formal complaints with the state education department, the accreditation board, and the civil rights office," she said. "Every single investigation was closed without action. The documentation always disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories, and the investigators seemed more interested in protecting Whitmore than pursuing justice." The second ally was Michael Chun, David Chun's father, the scholarship student, whose revocation notice I'd found in Dr. Rodriguez's files. He was a software engineer whose technical skills had proven invaluable in documenting the digital aspects of Whitmore's corruption. When they destroyed David's future, started investigating how they covered their tracks, he explained, opening a laptop filled with complex data analysis, discovered that they maintained parallel computer systems, one for official records that might be audited, and another for the real information they used to make decisions about students. Michael had used his technical expertise to identify the digital fingerprints of document modification, grade changes, and communication patterns that revealed the scope of institutional fraud. His analysis had uncovered the timing correlations between family donations and academic adjustments, providing quantitative proof of the pay-to-play system. Dr. Rodriguez spread out her research across the coffee tabula, comprehensive media contact list that represented months of careful investigation into journalists and officials who might have the courage and independence to take on Whitmore's powerful network. "We can't just dump evidence and hope someone pays attention," she explained. Catherine Wells tried that approach, and her evidence was suppressed before it could reach the right people. "We need a coordinated strategy that makes suppression impossible." The list included investigative reporters from major newspapers who had previously exposed educational corruption, federal prosecutors who specialized in institutional fraud cases, civil rights attorneys who handled systematic discrimination, and congressional staff members who worked on education oversight. But Dr. Rodriguez had also identified the people and organizations we needed to avoid journalists who had financial ties to Whitmore's donor families, prosecutors whose careers depended on political connections that could be threatened, and officials who had been compromised through the same network of influence that protected the school. The key is simultaneous disclosure to multiple independent sources, she explained. If we give the evidence to one person, it can be suppressed or discredited. But if we coordinate releases to 10 different organizations on the same day, the story becomes impossible to kill. Janet had developed the legal strategy for protecting ourselves and the evidence from retaliation. They'll try to destroy us personally and professionally, she warned. We need legal protections in place before we go public, and we need documented proof of any retaliation attempts. She'd researched whistleblower protection laws, identified pro bono attorneys who could represent us if necessary, and prepared legal filings that could be submitted immediately if Whitmore attempted to retaliate. Through lawsuits or criminal accusations, Michael's technical preparations were equally comprehensive. I've created secure, encrypted backups of all evidence stored in multiple locations, he explained. Even if they discover our investigation and try to destroy the proof, there will be copies they can't access or eliminate. He'd also developed a system for documenting our own activities and communications, creating time-stamped records that would prove our actions were legitimate investigation rather than criminal behavior. If Whitmore tried to frame us for theft or trespassing, we'd have evidence of our actual activities and motivations. The plan Dr. Rodriguez outlined was ambitious, but carefully thought through. We would coordinate our evidence release for a specific date in early December, giving us time to gather any remaining documentation and prepare for the inevitable backlash. The disclosure would begin with simultaneous contact to 3 major newspapers, to television investigative programs, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Each would receive identical evidence packages, making it impossible for Whitmore to claim the information was fabricated or taken out of context. We'll also contact the families of students who were harmed, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Parents, like the Martinezes, deserve to know the truth about what happened to their daughter, and they have the right to pursue their own legal action. But the most important aspect of our plan was protection for current and future students. We'd prepared a comprehensive package for the state education department that would trigger an immediate investigation and potential suspension of Whitmore's accreditation. The goal isn't just to expose what happened, Janet emphasized. To ensure this can never happen again, at Whitmore or anywhere else. Dr. Rodriguez had also prepared for the personal cost of our actions. They'll try to destroy our reputations, question our motives, and paint us as disgruntled employees or bitter parents, she said. We need to be prepared for character assassination, professional retaliation, and legal harassment. She documented our own backgrounds and motivations to counter the inevitable attacks on our credibility. My personnel record showed 3 years of excellent performance reviews with no disciplinary issues. Janet's legal career demonstrated commitment to justice and ethical practice. Michael's professional reputation and community involvement contradicted any claims of instability or vindictiveness. As we finalized our strategy that night, I felt the weight of responsibility for Jessica Martinez's memory, Catherine Wells' sacrifice, and all the students whose futures had been stolen by Whitmore's corruption. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The plan Dr. Rodriguez had developed wasn't just about revenge or even justice. It was about transformation. It's about ensuring that an institution dedicated to perpetuating privilege would be forced to serve its actual educational mission. When this is over, she said, as we prepared to leave, Whitmore will either be completely reformed or completely destroyed. Either way, it will never again be able to crush students' dreams to protect wealthy families' advantages. The media contact lists we developed represented more than just an exposure strategy. It was a roadmap for systematic change that would extend far beyond one corrupt institution. By demonstrating how educational fraud operated and how it could be exposed, we were creating a template that could be used to challenge corruption wherever it existed. As I drove home that night, I thought about Sarah's essay on justice and her belief that adults had an obligation to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. In less than 2 weeks, I would find out whether her faith in the power of truth was justified, or whether the forces protecting institutional corruption were too powerful to overcome. The plan was in place. The evidence was secured. A network of allies was prepared. Now we just had to find the courage to follow through on our commitment to the students who had suffered, the families who had been destroyed, and the principles that made education meaningful. December 15th began like any other Tuesday, But by noon, it had become the day that brought down one of the most prestigious private schools in the country. Our coordinated disclosure had worked exactly as Dr. Rodriguez had planned, creating a media firestorm that Whitmore's powerful network couldn't suppress or control. The first story broke at 6 a.m. when the Washington Post published investigative reporter Sarah Chen's explosive expose, titled "Elite School's Secret System: How Whitmore Academy Sold Grades and Destroyed Dreams." The article featured Jessica Martinez's letter, audio recordings of administrative planning sessions, and documentation of systematic grade fraud worth millions in fraudulent college admissions. By 8 a.m., 3 more major newspapers had published their own investigations based on our evidence packages. The New York Times focused on the university conspiracy, revealing how prestigious colleges actively participated in admissions fraud. The Wall Street Journal examined the financial structure, showing how donor payments directly correlated to academic modifications. The Los Angeles Times highlighted the civil rights violations, documenting how scholarship students were systematically persecuted and eliminated. The story gained momentum throughout the morning as television news programs picked up the investigation. By 10 a.m., CNN was broadcasting live from Whitmore's campus, where parents were arriving to demand answers about their children's education. The images were devastating wealthy families who had thought they were purchasing advantage for their children, suddenly realizing they had been participants in criminal fraud. But the most powerful moment came when the parents of Jessica Martinez appeared on national television, holding their daughter's letter and speaking about the institutional corruption that had driven her to suicide. Jessica died trying to protect other students from what Whitmore had done to her, Maria Martinez said, her voice steady despite obvious pain. She wanted parents to understand that this school was destroying children to protect wealthy families. Advantages. Today, finally, people are listening to what she tried to tell them. The Martinez family's attorney announced they were filing wrongful death suits against Whitmore Academy, Headmaster Blackwood, and 3 board members whose children had benefited from the grade modification system that had been used to persecute Jessica. By noon, the FBI had arrived at Whitmore's campus with search warrants for financial records, computer systems, and administrative files. Federal prosecutors announced they were opening criminal investigations into mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations that could result in decades of prison time for school officials. The response from Whitmore's administration was chaotic and desperate. Headmaster Blackwood held a hastily arranged press conference where he denied all allegations and claimed the evidence was fabricated by disgruntled former employees and bitter parents seeking financial gain, but his denials crumbled within hours as more victims came forward. Former students who had been pushed out of Whitmore began sharing their stories on social media, creating an avalanche of testimony that corroborated every detail of our documentation. Parents who had wondered why their qualified children were rejected while inferior candidates were accepted finally understood the truth about how admission decisions were really made. Dean Mitchell and Mrs. Pemberton were arrested at their homes before the day ended, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and civil rights violations. The footage of them being led away in handcuffs was broadcast on every major news network, destroying any remaining credibility the institution might have maintained. The university administrators who had participated in the admissions conspiracy faced their own investigations. Harvard placed 3 admissions officers on administrative leave. Princeton announced an internal review of all admissions decisions involving Whitmore students over the past 5 years. Yale suspended its special relationship with the school pending federal investigation. But the most satisfying development came late in the afternoon, when Sophia Martinez, Jessica's younger sister, who had been scheduled to start at Whitmore in the fall, appeared on camera outside her family's home. "Jessica died trying to protect me from what this school would have done to my future," she said, speaking with the same courage her sister had shown. "Because of her sacrifice, and because of the people who refused to let her death be meaningless, I'm going to get the real education she wanted for me. I'm going to make her proud." Sophia announced that she had received a full scholarship to attend a prestigious boarding school that had reached out after learning about Jessica's story. The scholarship was specifically created for students who had been harmed by educational corruption, ensuring that victims would receive the opportunities that institutions like Whitmore had tried to deny them. The financial impact on Whitmore was immediate and devastating. Major donors began withdrawing their support, unwilling to be associated with criminal fraud. Corporate sponsors canceled contracts, Alumni stopped contributing to endowment funds. School's bond rating was suspended, making it impossible to finance operations or capital improvements. More importantly, current families began withdrawing their children en masse. Parents who had paid enormous tuition fees expecting educational excellence discovered they had been purchasing fraudulent credentials that would be worthless if colleges discovered the truth about Whitmore's practices. The state education department announced they were reviewing Whitmore's accreditation and considering emergency suspension of the school's operating license. Without accreditation, Whitmore's diplomas would be meaningless, and students would be unable to transfer credits to legitimate institutions. As news of the investigation spread, I received calls from reporters wanting to interview the janitor who brought down Whitmore Academy, but I directed them all to Dr. Rodriguez, who would become our unofficial spokesperson and was doing an extraordinary job of keeping the focus on institutional reform rather than individual heroism. This isn't about any one person, she told a CNN reporter during a live broadcast from the school library where Catherine Wells had worked. This is about honoring the memory of students like Jessica Martinez and Catherine Wells, who died trying to protect others from educational fraud. This is about ensuring that merit matters more than money in American education. The evening news programs featured extensive coverage of our evidence, including audio recordings of administrators planning student persecution and documentation of grade modifications that had affected hundreds of families. The coverage was comprehensive and damning, making it impossible for Whitmore to claim the allegations were isolated incidents or misunderstandings. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from current scholarship students at Whitmore who organized a press conference to share their own experiences with institutional discrimination. Standing together on the school's marble steps, they spoke with courage that reminded me of Jessica Martinez's final letter. "We're not victims anymore," said Marcus Thompson, the scholarship student whose persecution I had witnessed being planned. "In those Wednesday night meetings, we're witnesses, and we're going to make sure every family understands how this system really worked." Their testimony provided real-time validation of everything our investigation had uncovered, proving that the corruption was ongoing and systematic rather than historical and isolated. As the day ended, sat in our small living room watching news coverage with Sarah, who had followed the story with the same passionate interest in justice that had inspired my investigation months earlier. "Dad," she said during a commercial break, "are you proud of what you did?" I thought about Jessica Martinez's letter, Catherine Wells' journal, and all the students whose dreams had been crushed by Whitmore's systematic corruption. "I'm proud that we didn't let their deaths be meaningless," I told her. "I'm proud that other students won't have to face what they faced. I'm proud that you live in a world where speaking truth to power can still make a difference." The news article draft that would be published the next morning was already making its way through editorial processes at newspapers across the country. The headline would read, "Whitmore Academy Scandal Exposes Systematic Corruption in Elite Education." But the real story wasn't about institutional failure. It was about the power of ordinary people to demand justice and create change. When they refused to accept corruption as normal, 6 months after the story broke, I stood in the same faculty lounge where I'd first discovered evidence of Whitmore's corruption, but everything had changed. The room had been transformed from a place where administrators planned student persecution into a conference space where new leadership was rebuilding the institution from the ground up. The new mission statement hung prominently on the wall, replacing the old marketing materials that had promised excellence while delivering fraud. Whitmore Academy is committed to educational integrity, merit-based achievement, and equal opportunity for all students, regardless of family background or financial status. We believe that character and capability matter more than connections and contributions. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. In the weeks following our disclosure, Whitmore had teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Federal investigations led to criminal convictions for Headmaster Blackwood, Dean Mitchell, and 6 other administrators. Mrs. Pemberton received the longest sentence at years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The Board of Trustees had been completely replaced, with new members specifically chosen for their commitment to educational integrity rather than their donation capacity. The new board's first action was hiring Dr. Patricia Williams as headmaster, a respected educator, whose previous experience included turning around failing public schools, and whose reputation for uncompromising academic standards made her the perfect choice to rebuild Whitmore's credibility. Under her leadership, Whitmore had implemented radical changes that addressed every aspect of the corruption we'd exposed. Grade modifications were now impossible. Academic records were maintained in transparent systems with multiple oversight layers, as college recommendations were written by committees rather than individuals, ensuring that family influence couldn't corrupt the process. Most importantly, the scholarship program had been completely restructured. Instead of admitting exceptional students only to push them out, Whitmore now provided comprehensive support to ensure their success. Scholarship recipients received mentoring, tutoring, and advocacy to help them thrive in the academic environment. Their merit had earned them. The financial impact of the scandal had been severe, but ultimately beneficial. Major donors who had expected academic favors for their contributions were gone, but they were replaced by new supporters who valued educational integrity. Alumni giving actually increased as graduates who had earned their achievements honestly took pride in supporting an institution that reflected their values. Several wealthy families whose children had received fraudulent grades in college admissions faced their own consequences. Universities had revoked admissions and degrees in cases where fraud was proven. Students who had learned they couldn't succeed without systematic cheating struggled in legitimate academic environments, finally facing the reality that money couldn't substitute for knowledge and effort. But the most meaningful changes involved the students whose lives had been destroyed by the old system. Jessica Martinez was posthumously awarded a scholarship in her name. It would annually support a student who demonstrated her combination of academic excellence and moral courage. Tafia Martinez had graduated at the top of her class from the boarding school that recruited her after the scandal and was now a freshman at MIT studying education policy. David Chen had been readmitted to Whitmore with a full scholarship and was excelling in the reformed environment. Marcus Thompson, the scholarship student whose persecution I had witnessed being planned, was now student body president and had been accepted to Harvard based on his genuine academic achievements rather than family connections. Dr. Rodriguez had been promoted to academic dean, a position created specifically to ensure that educational integrity remained the institution's primary focus. Janet Morrison had been asked to serve on the new board of trustees. Bringing her legal expertise and commitment to justice to the governance of the institution her daughter's experience had helped reform. Michael Chen had developed software systems that other schools were adopting to prevent the kind of fraud that had corrupted Whitmore. His technical solutions were being implemented nationwide, creating transparency and accountability that made systematic academic corruption much more difficult to hide. The personal cost of our investigation had been significant, but worthwhile. I had lost my job at Whitmore not through retaliation, but because the new administration wanted to start fresh with staff who hadn't been part of the corrupt system. But the publicity from the case had led to opportunities I never could have imagined. I was now working as an investigative consultant, helping other institutions identify and address educational corruption. My experience at Whitmore had taught me how to recognize the signs of systematic fraud, and schools across the country were hiring me to ensure their own integrity. More importantly, Sarah had watched the entire process and learned lessons about courage, justice, and the power of speaking truth to power that no classroom could have taught her. She was now in high school herself, consistently earning excellent grades through hard work rather than family influence, and talking about becoming an investigative journalist to continue the fight for educational justice. The legal settlements from Whitmore's insurance companies had provided financial compensation for families whose children had been harmed by the corrupt system. The Martinez family had used their settlement to establish a foundation supporting students who faced educational discrimination, ensuring that Jessica's death would continue saving other